She had always assumed Stroud saw people the way he saw numbers, useful until they weren't, and then quietly removed from the ledger. 5 years of managing his books had taught her that much. 5 years of watching him sit across conference tables from men twice his age and dismantle them with nothing more than a manila folder and a silence that lasted 3 beats too long. He never raised his voice. He never had to. The men who worked for Cole Stroud learned fast that the quieter he got, the more expensive the consequence. Rhea had learned something else. The safest place in any room containing Stroud was directly across from him. Not beside him, not behind him, and certainly never in his blind spot. You kept your lines clean, your margins honest, and your personal life far from anything he could see. She was doing a very poor job of that on a Wednesday evening in November when she walked into the Distillery district, wearing a green dress that had been hanging in her closet since July. The Thursday before, she had told him she was leaving at 5. She'd said it flat, without preface, not looking up from the bank reconciliation she was finishing, giving him no room to redirect the conversation before the words were already out. I have a commitment Thursday evening. The corner office on the 22nd floor of the Wellington Street Tower was quiet enough that she could hear the low click of his pen against the glass desk. He was reading a contract. He was always reading a contract. What kind of commitment? It wasn't a question. With Stroud, almost nothing was. His sentences landed like balance sheet entries, recorded, categorized, filed. Personal, Rhea said. The pen stopped. The silence that followed had a particular quality, not the productive kind, but the attentive kind, the kind she associated with him identifying something that wasn't adding up. You don't take personal time. My contracted hours are 9 to 5:30. She saved the file and moved to the next one. I'm adjusting by 30 minutes. The Galveston shipping transfer. Reconciled. Forwarded to legal at 2:15. She closed the folder on her left. The flagged entries from last quarter are tabbed in the blue binder on your desk. Yellow tabs are yours. Red tabs are mine and are already handled. The Harbor Board analysis is on the shared drive, color-coded by year. She picked up her bag. Green is current. Orange is projected. She heard him set the pen down entirely. She finally looked up. He was watching her from behind the desk with that particular stillness she had catalogued dozens of times. Not the stillness of a man at rest. Stroud was never at rest. It was the stillness of something listening to a frequency other people couldn't hear. She had seen it when Carlo's crew tried to slip a shell acquisition through the quarterly filings without her noticing. She had seen it when the Port Authority contact called from a number that wasn't his usual line. She had not, in 5 years, expected to see it directed at her over a question of after-hours scheduling. "Fine," he said. She left at 5 o'clock and didn't look back. His name was Stuart. He was a high school mathematics teacher from Scarborough who had asked her out 3 times over 6 weeks through a dating app before she finally said yes, mostly because her best friend Adeze had looked at her social calendar and used the phrase genuinely alarming, and that had been hard to dismiss. Stuart arrived 8 minutes early, which she appreciated because she'd arrived 6 minutes early and had been standing in the November cold wondering if the green dress was a miscalculation. He held the door. He'd made a reservation at a place in the Distillery district. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs, a wine list that was ambitious for a teacher's budget. And she could tell from the way he'd studied the menu that he wanted to make a good impression and had cared enough to stretch for it. By 7:15 they had found an easy rhythm. He was telling her about a student who had solved a geometry problem by working backwards from the answer, in a way that wasn't in any textbook, and Rhea found herself not just listening but following the logic, leaning forward slightly, and she became aware somewhere in the middle of his story that she could not, at that moment, name a single account number. She didn't notice the man standing outside the glass. Stroud had come back from Montreal 6 hours ahead of schedule because the negotiation had collapsed faster than projected, and there was no point sitting in a hotel suite running calculations he could run equally well. On the 401, his driver Anton had rerouted through the Distillery district to avoid an accident on the Gardiner, cutting down the cobblestone lane the way he always did on Wednesday evenings. Stroud noticed everything he passed. It wasn't a discipline he'd cultivated. It was older than discipline, more reflexive, the passive surveillance of a man who had survived long enough to understand that the details other people filtered out were usually the ones that cost the most. He found her in the time it took to process 4 other windows. The car slowed for a pedestrian crossing, and in that deceleration Stroud had 3 full seconds to take in the restaurant's front glass. The table left of center, the green dress he had never seen before, and the particular set of her shoulders, the one he'd spent 5 years watching from the opposite side of a desk and had never once seen that unguarded. "Pull over," he said. Anton pulled over. Stroud got out into the November mist without his coat. He stood on the cobblestones with his hands in his pockets and looked through the glass the way he looked at anything he was trying to understand, with total attention and without any particular expression. He was good at being invisible when he needed to be. It was a skill you developed in certain kinds of environments, and he had lived in those environments since he was 17. She laughed at something the man said. It wasn't the laugh he knew, the brief, professional acknowledgement she produced when a client said something mildly clever. This was entirely different, unguarded, real. It changed the geometry of her face in a way he had not seen before and could not in the moment categorize, which was its own kind of problem. Then the man rested his hand over hers on the tablecloth, not grabbing, just placing, the most ordinary, domestic, uncomplicated gesture in the world. Stroud stood on the lane for another 40 seconds. He looked at the man's face the way he looked at everything he intended to remember, without effort, without needing to write it down anywhere. Then he turned and got back in the car. "Office," he said. Anton drove. He did not ask questions. He had worked for Stroud long enough to understand that the questions worth asking were never the ones that presented themselves immediately. Rhea was good at her job because she did not leave loose threads. She had taught herself that at 19, in a basement apartment in Hamilton where the heat failed in January and her mother worked double shifts and there was never quite enough of anything, money, space, warmth, dignity. You learned to account for every dollar or the dollar disappeared. You learned to close the loop or the loop eventually closed around you. So when Friday morning produced nothing unusual at her desk, she did not relax. The week moved normally. Stroud arrived at his usual time, conducted his meetings, reviewed his contracts. He was courteous in the precisely bounded way he was always courteous. Nothing more, nothing less. She ran his behavior against 5 years of baseline and found no significant deviation. She was nearly convinced she'd been wrong by Wednesday. Then an internal line rang from the real estate division, a junior analyst asking if she could cross-reference a new acquisition, a small consulting firm out of Scarborough, recent purchase, quiet. Rhea wrote down the company name. She looked at it. She opened the acquisition file. It took her 38 minutes to trace the full thread. She was fast, and she'd helped build the shell architecture herself, which meant she knew exactly where the seams were. The holding company was registered in New Brunswick. The parent trust was one she had set up personally 3 years ago for a harbor-side deal. The transaction was time-stamped Friday morning, the day after her dinner. Stuart Weatherby, principal of a 6-person consulting firm in Scarborough, municipal infrastructure contract, value just under $1 million over 4 years. The contract had been reassigned to a Calgary subsidiary. Stuart had been offered a relocation package. Generous, not the burn and abandon method she'd seen Stroud use with actual enemies, but the quieter kind. Move the variable, redirect the flow. Create circumstances so reasonable-looking that the person accepts without quite understanding why everything has changed. She sat very still. She felt the cold, precise quality of a fury she had not experienced in years. Not hot, not impulsive, but methodical, the kind that starts in the chest and builds outward with perfect clarity. She picked up the folder and walked to his office. He was on the phone. He glanced up when she entered, held up one finger. She walked to his desk and placed the folder open in front of him without waiting. He looked down. That fractional shift happened in his face, a single unguarded second before the wall came back up. She had learned to clock those moments the way you clock an irregular heartbeat. Easy to miss if you weren't paying exactly the right kind of attention. "I'll call you back." He ended the call, set the phone on the desk, did not touch the folder. "Is there a discrepancy?" "That depends on your definition." Her voice was level. She had made a decision in the hallway. This conversation was going to stay cold, because cold was the only register he actually heard. "Stuart Weatherby, no exposure to your operations, no professional connection to your holdings, no reason to appear in your acquisition records, except that he had dinner with me on Thursday." She waited a beat. "You bought his consulting firm. You moved his municipal contract to Alberta. You packaged it as an opportunity so he'd accept without understanding what was happening to him. The Calgary contract is substantially larger." Stroud said it evenly. "You moved him to Calgary. It's a sound investment. That's 22 hours from Toronto, if you're driving." He looked up at her. Not the calculating look, the other one. The one she'd seen through the restaurant glass without knowing it. The one that had nothing to do with assessment and everything to do with something he hadn't managed to contain. "He wasn't right for you," Stroud said. "That's your reason." She kept her voice flat with effort. "You watched us for 3 minutes through a restaurant window and bought his livelihood. He touched your hand. He was on a date with me. That's what people do." She took one controlled breath. "You had no right." "No," he said it without softening it. "No qualification, I didn't. I'm giving you 2 weeks' notice. The transition file will be complete before I go." She picked up the folder and walked out. Behind her, she heard something being set down on the glass desk with very controlled force, which from Stroud was equivalent to a different man putting his fist through a wall. She didn't turn around. 3 weeks, 21 days. The logistics company on Bay Street paid her well, kept reasonable hours, and contained absolutely nothing that had ever required her presence at 2 in the morning. Her colleagues were professional and friendly, and considered a delayed shipment to be a genuine crisis, which in their world it was. Their world had quarterly targets and performance reviews, and a break room with a proper espresso machine that nobody had to ask twice how to use. Nobody needed her to reconstruct a set of shell accounts from memory in a waterfront parking garage at midnight. Nobody ever looked at her like she was the only variable in the room that mattered. She turned down a competing offer from a larger firm on a Tuesday and sat in her clean apartment and tried to identify precisely what was wrong. Nothing was wrong. It was safe. It was rational. It was what you built when you had come from nothing and refused to go back. She was still sitting with that thought when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Anton's voice, careful in the specific way it got when something had gone badly wrong. "There was a meeting," he said. "The Vasiliev Group. They've been watching the Wellington accounts. There were gaps. The filings weren't being tracked the way they were before. They thought they saw an opening. A pause. They were right. Rhea didn't move. Where is he?" "Corktown, the property on the side street." She heard him exhale. "He told me not to call you. He was specific about it. He said if I brought you near this, he'd—" "What's the address?" Rhea said. She was already putting on her coat. She had processed the property taxes on the Corktown row house for 4 years and knew its floor plan without needing to think about it. The basement door was slightly ajar, which told her Anton had gone in and been sent back out, which told her something about the state Stroud was in. She pushed it open. He was on an old leather sofa under a single work light, stripped to his undershirt, which was soaked through on the left side, pale in the way people get when they are losing a slow argument with their own body. The gun on his thigh came up the instant the door moved, and it stayed up for 2 full seconds while his eyes worked through the shadows. Then he recognized her. His hand went slack, the gun slid to the floor. He looked at her. She had seen that expression on him once before, years ago, when a harbor deal had gone sideways, and 2 weeks of work had collapsed in a single evening. A man staring at the thing he hadn't managed to protect. "Antanta," he said. "Disobeyed you. He'll survive." She dropped her bag on a wooden crate and crouched down to look at the wound. Someone had packed it badly. "So will you if you stop being difficult about it." She opened the kit she'd had Anton stop for on the way. "Lift your arm, slowly." He lifted it. He didn't make a sound when she worked, which told her things she'd already suspected about his pain threshold. She had seen him sign documents with a fractured wrist once. She had filed it, at the time, under things that explain other things. "You gave me notice," he said. "I did." "Then why?" "Because I am not finished being angry with you." She pressed clean gauze to the wound and held the pressure. She looked up at him. He was looking back with an expression she had no prior category for, not blank, not calculating, not the controlled stillness he wore like body armor. Just open. "Worn through, and I don't get to finish being angry with you properly if you bleed out in a basement in Corktown." He almost laughed. The pain got in the way and he turned it into a breath. "That's not a reason," he said. "It's my reason." She reached for the tape. "You're going to make Stuart Weatherby whole. Career, contract, city deal, and a reason that makes professional sense for why the acquisition reverses. Not because you feel generous, because it's the right thing, and you're going to do it because I'm asking you to, and you are going to understand the difference between managing an asset and respecting a person." A long pause. He accepted the Calgary position. "Then you'll find a way to undo it cleanly." She held his gaze. "Whatever it costs." Stroud looked at her, too. "All right," he said. She taped the bandage. She worked in silence. The basement was cold and smelled of old stone, and the particular metallic air of its space closed up for too long. The furnace kicked on somewhere below them, and the single light swayed. "I knew," Rhea said quietly. He went very still. "Not the specifics, not the acquisition." She stripped off the gloves. "But I knew you saw me that night. Because you were different the next morning, and I know every version of you that has ever walked into that office. I know you the way you know a set of accounts you've been running for years. I know where the numbers are supposed to land, and I know when something's off." She looked at the floor. "I told myself I was imagining it. I was very efficient about it." "Rhea." His voice was stripped of every professional register she had ever catalogued. "You don't get to own me," she said. "I've worked too hard building something from nothing to hand the deed to anyone, not to creditors when I was 19, not to every employer who looked at my file and saw a community college certificate and a Hamilton address, and not to you." She finally looked directly at him. He was watching her with the absolute focused attention he gave nothing else, not contracts, not rivals, not the endless calculations she knew ran constantly behind his eyes, just her. "But..." She let the word settle between them. "I've spent 3 weeks in a very clean apartment trying to feel like I've won something," she said, "and the only thing I've felt is that the stakes are wrong. The ceiling is too low, and the floor is too safe, and I can't breathe properly in a room where nobody's going to call me at midnight because the whole operation is about to fall apart." She tilted her head slightly. "You are a controlling and ruthless man, Mr. Stroud. You had a secondary school mathematics teacher relocated to Alberta because he bought me a glass of wine. It was a good bottle, quiet, almost involuntary. That is genuinely not the point." His eyes hadn't moved from her face. "It isn't." She sat back on her heels. "I'm not coming back to work the same way I left. The terms change. You make Stuart whole, completely, cleanly, in a way that doesn't humiliate him. And what exists between you and me stops being something you manage from behind a desk and starts being something you're actually present for." She looked at him steadily. Those are the conditions. They aren't negotiable. Stroud held her gaze for a long moment. The calculation she usually saw moving behind his eyes was absent. He looked like a man who had been running a very long projection and had finally arrived at a number he hadn't expected but couldn't argue with. "And if I agree," he said. "Then we figure out the rest without a contract," Rhea said, "because that part was never in any ledger." He reached up and took her hand. Not the way Stuart had done it at the restaurant, easy and warm and uncomplicated. He held it the way a man holds something he's not sure he deserves to have. Carefully, with a tension that wasn't possessiveness, but something closer to terrified attention. "I've been running numbers my whole life," Stroud said. His voice was low and stripped and entirely unperformed. "I have never once found a variable I couldn't account for." Rhea looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, "that's been your problem." She sat down beside him on the old leather sofa. She didn't let go of his hand. Outside, November pressed against the row house windows, and the city kept moving above them, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing that had ever happened between them. Stuart Weatherby received a call from a private number the following Tuesday. He was offered the original municipal contract back, restructured to be more defensible long-term, accompanied by a written letter from the acquiring company's legal division, citing a misrepresentation in the initial offer and formally withdrawing the relocation package. The letter was clear, unambiguous, and left him with no obligation and no loss. He accepted without fully understanding what had changed, only that his instinct to stay in the city had apparently been sound. Rhea drafted the letter herself. She proofread it twice. She made sure the language was clean and left nothing loose, and that the apology, such as it was, read like one rather than like a liability document. She sent it on a Thursday morning. Then she walked into the Wellington Street Tower, took the elevator to the 22nd floor, and sat down at her desk. Stroud came out of his office at 9:15. He looked at her. He said nothing. She held out his coffee, black, no sugar, the ratio she had memorized in her first week, and never needed to think about again. He took it, and their fingers didn't quite touch, and the weight of 5 years of deliberate distance shifted between them the way pressure shifts over a lake before the weather changes. "The Galveston audit," he said. "Needs a second pass. I flagged it last week." She was already opening the file. "Blue binder, yellow tabs are yours." He stood there a moment longer than the exchange required. She could feel the quality of his attention the way she had always felt it, specific, unblinking, and she had, at long last, entirely run out of the particular lie she had used to explain it to herself. "Rhea." She looked up. "Thank you," he said, and he said it the way he said almost nothing, directly, without softening, like something it had cost him to locate, and he had decided finally was worth paying. She held his gaze for one beat, too. "Don't give me a reason to regret it," she said. She went back to work. He went back to his office. The 22nd floor settled into its usual quiet, and through the windows Toronto moved in the grey November light, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unaware that somewhere in a corner office above Wellington Street, the terms of a ledger that had never been written down had finally been agreed to, and the person who had dictated them was not Cole Stroud.